He was a husband, a father, and a Christian political leader who considered his public role of emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the early 20th century as a holy service to his people. Tonight, we'll learn more about this great leader who tried to follow God's will in war and in peace. So please stay with us. Thank you very much and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from all over the world. Before we get to our guest tonight, I want to mention that today is the feast of Saint Luke the Evangelist, who wrote the Gospel of Luke. He joined St. Paul in his missionary journey in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, right around the year 50. And he sailed with Paul over to Europe, and they began together the first evangelization in Europe at Philippi. St. Luke stayed behind as Paul went on to get into plenty of trouble in other cities, as around in Thessalonica, Athens, and Corinth, and Ephesus. And then in the year 58, he rejoined St. Paul in his journey back to the Holy Land. He stayed with Paul while he was a prisoner there for almost 2 years, and then went with him to Rome and stayed with him for the next couple of years. It's during that time that he most likely wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. And then later on, just from the style of writing and the mention of Luke in the letters to Timothy and Titus, that he was St. Paul's secretary who wrote the letters because of the special vocabulary that is Luke's own words and vocabulary. So he was martyred around the year 84, almost 20 years after St. Paul. And we celebrate him not only by reading his gospel, but also by seeking to live the missionary life in our own world. Now, tonight we have guests who realize that the world is in desperate need for good role models for those in political power today. Not all the politicians are so nice people, and not all of them are so upright. So, Blessed Karl I of Austria is a shining example of how to exercise political power appropriately and in a Christian way, and that political power should always be closely linked to personal holiness and prayer. Here to tell us more about Blessed Karl, please welcome his granddaughter, Princess Maria Anna Galitzin, along with 2 delegates from the Emperor Karl League of Prayer, Suzanne Pearson and Father Boniface Hicks. Your Highness, welcome. Welcome. Thank you. Good to see you. Father, welcome. It's a real delight. I had begun, when I knew we were planning this program, I began to look at some of the materials. There's some wonderful things on the internet about your grandfather, Blessed Karl, and also your grandmother, his wife, the Empress Zita, servant of God. And one of the special connections for me is that my grandparents were born in the empire and left in the Polish section that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they left Poland when your grandfather was emperor. And it's really one of those great little bits of history that we meet here in America.
Wonderful.
In this situation. And first of all, I'd like to start off, Father, you are both here working with this League of Blessed Carl, which is what exactly? Who would like to start?
It's a prayer league, first of all.
Yeah.
And it was started by people, it was started early on when Carl was only a little boy, when his tutor was instructed by a mystic nun with the stigmata that people better pray very hard for this little Archduke, because someday he will be emperor.
And that was an odd thing to say, because he was not in the direct line of succession.
There were quite a few people ahead, and what everybody thought is that there would be more to come, because Franz Ferdinand would have children, and he was never expected to be emperor, so this was a surprise. But she not only said that someday he will be emperor, but most of all, he will have to suffer greatly and be a special target of hell. And so people ought to start praying for him. And so the League of Prayer, in a very small way in Sopron, Hungary, was begun. And it continued to be basically, and still is, a League of Prayer. At first, they prayed for blessings for Emperor Karl, because he was dealing with such difficult situations. And then he went into exile. And he used his exile years, when he could no longer serve his people as emperor, he used his exile years and dedicated himself to prayer and expiation for his people. And the League, when he died, endeavored to continue his prayer and his expiation, because they could see that the world still needed it.
Absolutely.
And then, when the cause, very quickly, a year after his death, one of the people who worked under him in the monarchy asked the Cardinal of Vienna to open the cause. And it was only natural that this league that was already focused on praying for him would be the one to promote his cause. But they always emphasize that the main way we promote it is by prayer.
Okay. And Father, you also are involved in this prayer league?
That's right. Suzanne and I are both delegates in the United States for the League of Prayer.
So this is an international league?
Very much so. And there's an annual meeting which took place in a special place this year. Normally it takes place near Vienna, near the place where Karl lived and labored. But this year we had the opportunity to meet with Pope Francis. He invited us to a private audience, because this League of Prayer today and the memory of Blessed Karl and his intercession is not just something of the past, but is something very important also for the present. Right now, in 2017, we celebrate 100 years since 1917, when Pope Benedict XV made a peace proposal in the midst of World War I. It was
so folks understand too, World War I had begun in 1914. It sort of rumbled towards this catastrophe, so that by late July and into August, hostilities began, and it lasted until November 11th, 1918. So it was a 4-year war that in which about 25 million people died. So that's when, and the Pope, before it ends, well over a year before, Pope Benedict is coming up with a peace plan.
And Blessed Karl was the only leader of a nation who accepted that peace plan unconditionally. Blessed Karl, who played no role in starting the war, became emperor in the middle of the war and immediately began to work for peace. And this dimension of Pope Francis's magisterium is significant today, calling for peace, calling for an end to war. And so he wanted to highlight both the proposal for peace of his predecessor, as well as the one world leader who accepted that peace, that plan for peace unconditionally.
Yeah. It's one of the things too that's worth noting. The nations, for the most, except for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had really opted for a nationalistic ideology that put the nation ahead of God or the church. And the concept of the folk or the state or some notion along those lines put humans ahead of God and the church. And that's one of the reasons, by ideology, everybody but Emperor Karl rejected the Pope, because they have nothing to say. We'll take care of it. Now, Your Highness, Emperor Karl was your grandfather. Did you know him?
No, I didn't know him because he died before I was born, but whom I knew very well was his wife, my grandmother, Empress Zita, and she talked to us about him mostly when we were asking questions. And she was a person very humble, so she would never brag about anything. But when I asked her question about Blessed Karl, she told me mostly about his deep faith. And he was somebody who was very attached to the heart of Jesus. And she told me this little story that when Emperor Karl was in church and she was next to him, he was so deeply in his prayers that he never saw that there was the collector for money. And so she used to put money in his fingers so the collector could take it out. So that means he was so much in his prayers. But he was also a great husband, of course. And when she spoke about him, you saw the love. My grandmother still have this love in her eyes, talking about him. He must have been a fantastic husband. And he was, of course, a wonderful, wonderful father. He had so much to do, and his schedule was so hard, but then he was always ready to go and be with the children, reading, praying, and so he was very, very close to his children.
Now, of course, your grandfather was Austrian.
Yes.
But your grandmother was not.
No, she was French. Mm-hmm. She was Bourbon. And
and by Bourbon, that means?
She was from the big family, the royal family of France. Yes. And that was a very big problem during the war because, you know, Austria was, of course, against France. And so for her, it was a big sacrifice because she heard always that some people were calling her traitors. Mm-hmm. And so and it was also very hard for her husband who was fighting for peace, and so that was very hard for them. But with the help of each other, like my grandfather was saying, we have to help each other to go to heaven. They were forever helping each other in all difficult situations.
That would be a classic example where, you know, folks who would be so nationalistic, they couldn't accept that your grandmother was a good wife,
a good person,
and
yes.
and that she was not trying to sabotage.
Of course,
they couldn't imagine otherwise.
Yes.
When did they marry?
They got married in 1911, mm-hmm. and it's interesting to see that it was on the 21st of October 1911. Because then, if you know, the Pope, John Paul II, decided to commemorate this date as the date in church for commemorating Blessed Karl, so every 21st of October. And that means why? Because I think Blessed Karl is a wonderful example for couples, for married couples, for family. Nowadays we have so many problems, and I think, you know, asking Blessed Karl our help and guidance, what I do always, because I hope to pull some strings if I have any problems. I think this is somebody who would understand any problem in a couple.
We see, this has been part of the horrible news of late, that people with power, whether economic or politicians with power, will brag about being able to manipulate women at their will. But that was not how he treated your grandmother.
No, not at all. On the contrary, whenever he had some decision and whatever he was doing as work, he was always talking to his wife, asking her advice. But my grandmother always said that he was taking the last advice. So she was giving her ideas, her aspect of what she was seeing, but he was taking the decision. But he was very much sharing everything with her, of course, in an equal way.
And it's important to realize how this was a time where some kings were still fairly absolute.
Absolutely, yes.
And this, you know, the will of the emperor was very seriously done, but that's not how he acted. No. And that holiness for him included that respect and honor to his wife as well as to his people.
Absolutely, and he understood very well what Christ was saying. You have to love the next, the neighbor, more than yourself, and that was what he was doing. He was helping and loving, in fact, everybody around him, his people, as much as his wife and his children. So he was happy and ready to sacrifice himself for the good of the others, and that was his number one ideas.
And when they married in 1911, again, there was no idea that he would be emperor.
Exactly.
He had a great uncle.
There was the son of Franz Joseph, the last emperor, who reigned for a long, long time, Rudolf, who died in Mayerling, and that was the next. Then after him was his uncle, the uncle of my grandfather, who should have been the next emperor, but
and that was Archduke Ferdinand.
Franz Ferdinand.
Yes.
And he was killed in Sarajevo. And this is something that started the First World War.
Yes, it was his assassin and also his wife.
His wife, both
Sophie.
of them. Yes.
They were both assassinated by a terrorist in Sarajevo, who was a nationalistic guy.
Absolutely.
Another
yes.
occasion
and
of that.
And you're right
that
nationalism is something that was very much, not only in Austria, but in lots of big empires, mostly and locally Christian empires.
And also in the republics like France.
Yes, exactly.
They kind of started it.
Yeah.
And so this is something that you know, they married without any expectation
Absolutely
of
not.
being on the throne. But after 1914, then he's actually the next in line.
And my grandmother said that when they got the news of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, she was horrified. And her Blessed Karl also, because they didn't want to be in that position. Mm-hmm. In fact, they wanted to have a family, and they were really, really shocked. But you must know that Franz Ferdinand was also aware that there would be perhaps some assassination attempt. Yeah, thank you. And so my grandfather spoke to him, and he said, "You know, it's very possible that I will die and that you have to come." So it's sure that my grandfather felt that he would be perhaps the next one, but not so soon.
Now, this other issue then that comes up during the war, what year did he become emperor?
He became emperor in 1916.
16. So the war had been going on for 2 years, had another 2 years to go.
Right. Yes.
And it was horrible. You know, that's nothing. In the first battle in August 1914, 1 million Russians died.
Yes.
You know, they were fighting the Germans in Poland. 1 million in one battle.
Yeah.
It was horrendous. I recommend reading Solzhenitsyn's August 1914 to get a sense of the horror. Mm-hmm. And it continued on. But when he became emperor, he was looking for a way to have peace and end the war right away.
Yes.
Because this was clearly fruitless.
Yes.
And he'd been in the front as well, hadn't he?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So he wasn't just sitting back eating bonbons. He was in the front
No,
and saw
never.
the reality
Yes.
of war, that it's not good. So how did he and Pope Benedict XV make a connection? What was the link? Suzanne?
Well, Emperor Karl had been working for peace. He had been putting out peace feelers. He had been negotiating at every level of government with enemies, with allies, and with neutral countries. Even before he became emperor, he went on a mission for Franz Joseph to try and make peace. And so he had been working on this for a long time, before Pope Benedict put out his peace plan. I think, so it was not something that was new to Emperor Karl by any means. He had been working on this before he ever became emperor. And in very substantial feelers, he had various levels of his government negotiating with various people. He negotiated with Woodrow Wilson before the United States ever came into the war. And he tried to make
by the way, so folks understand, that was 1916 that we entered the war.
We entered, yes, and later than that, actually, with Austria-Hungary. It started, the United States began by only fighting Germany.
Right.
But, so it was later than that, and the ambassador from the United States, who was in Vienna at that time, kept writing back, and he was amazed at how the various nationalities of the empire fought so well side by side, and they seemed so, I mean, contrary to the propaganda that was spread in this country about how the empire was falling apart. According to the ambassador that was there, that wasn't true even. So it was a natural for him to support Pope Benedict when he came up.
But to understand also that Blessed Karl and the kings of the Austro-Hungarian Empire were specifically Catholic. And Blessed Karl was crowned King of Hungary in a coronation ritual by the Cardinal of Hungary. And so the connection with the Holy Father was already well established. Pope Benedict XV said on one occasion, "Karl is my most faithful son." And there was a very warm communication and a deep mutual appreciation because, again, Karl was, and the empire was specifically Catholic, although certainly tolerant of others who lived in its boundaries, but it was really the last vestige politically of the Holy Roman Empire, and so.
Yeah, the Napoleon had demolished the Holy Roman Empire, but the Austrian Empire took its place. And the French government during the war, World War II, was very anti-Catholic. The Third Republic of France had kicked lots of the priests and nuns out of the country. They hated the Catholic Church, so they weren't going to listen to the Pope. Of course, the English, the Queen then was a king, was head of the church. And so this is, something that in the United States was not Catholic. So this was not warmth toward the papacy making overtures of peace. There was antagonism by these other governments. And the Prussians, of course, were not Catholic at all, Lutheran.
But that's not to say that Pope Benedict XV's peace plan was simply dreamt up by a religious leader who was out of touch with the modern world. Historians since then have analyzed his plan and said it would have worked very well and would have avoided much of the bloodshed and unrest
way
that followed.
Better than the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh, yes.
Which inflicted so much vengeance, which is exactly what the absence of God does. They saw vengeance as the way of justice with no place for mercy. And that's what undid the peace in the long run. This is, Pope John Paul II was the one who beatified your grandfather. Yes. And he did so October 3rd in 2004. I'd like just to read a little bit from his homily at the canonization, if I may. It's the decisive task of Christians consists in seeking, recognizing, and following God's will in all things. The Christian statesman Charles of Austria, Emperor Karl, confronted this challenge every day. To his eyes, war appeared as, quote, something appalling. Amid the tumult of the First World War, he strove to promote the peace initiative of my predecessor, Benedict XV. From the beginning, the Emperor Karl conceived of his office as a holy service to his people. His chief concern was to follow the Christian vocation to holiness also in his political actions. For this reason, his thoughts turned to social assistance. May he be an example for all of us, and especially for those who have political responsibilities in Europe today. And I would add, in America and South America and Africa and Asia and every country, we need to have that kind of holiness among our politicians. And I can't help but notice in places where people have no concern for that, political corruption follows quickly. It makes a difference. And that's why we as Catholics should bring our faith into the voting booth where we can vote. It's dumb to keep it outside, if not worse than dumb. And you, by the way, Johannes, you live here in the United States, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So, so you get to vote. You're a citizen.
Yes.
Yes. See. So you're
You will
citizen
ask me
too.
to whom I vote?
No, I know nothing. Nothing. No, we don't. That's your concern. But you know what you present to us about your grandfather shows us that our faith makes a difference in our politics.
Yes.
That's what's key.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned the corruption that can creep in governments that don't have a moral foundation in faith. And Blessed Karl had to face that in his own government as well, but precisely his faith as the ruler was continually battling corruption and his own integrity and his unwillingness to lie and his unwillingness even to treat himself differently. He subjected the same rationing to the royal household that the people themselves had to suffer in the midst of war. He sent out the royal carriages to bring coal to those who didn't have coal for their fires. He put his own resources, his personal resources, in the service, sold them and gave the money to the people. He was a ruler who didn't hold himself above everyone else, but used his power to serve everyone else. And so, as Blessed St. John Paul II said in the Beatification homily, really a model of a Christian statesman who brings his Christian morality, his Christian principles and integrity into his service.
Yeah.
I'd like to add too, you have called our attention more than once to the fact of how much difference it makes to have faith, to have your Christian religion. And Blessed Karl also, before everything he did, he prayed very hard. He went to Mass every morning, and he determined to say the rosary every day, even if at midnight, Empress Zita would come and get him out of an important meeting so they could still say the rosary. And he also said that before every important meeting, he prayed to his own guardian angel and to the guardian angel of the person he was going to meet with. And he constantly called upon St. Michael the Archangel. He made him the patron of the army, of the military forces. And he called upon the saints of the empire, the King Leopold, a former a saint of Austria, and St. Wenceslas of Bohemia, and King Stephen of Hungary. And he called upon all he was constantly, I don't know how to express this adequately, but no matter what he was doing, he remained in a state of union with God. In an almost miraculous way, considering how much responsibility he had.
And at the same time, knowing the business of the state, knowing how to run things. It's not just up in the air, but
right.
always keeping that balance of the political praxis and the realities of heaven. This is an important balance. And your league still meets. Is it to pray for what? What? It's a prayer league. What do you pray for?
Originally, the intentions were in reparation for all sins committed against the authority of God and the legitimate authority of men, and for peace among all the nations and peoples of the world. But later, when the cause for Emperor Karl was begun, they also added the prayer that Emperor Karl would be quickly beatified. And now, of course, they pray that he will quickly be canonized.
Yes. Well, I think at this time we have someone like, the present premier of North Korea, who builds villas and eats caviar and fine scotch and all these things, whilst people, are making soup out of grass.
Right.
They have nothing. And, to pray, as the Emperor Karl did, for his guardian angel.
Yes.
Pray for the guardian angel of our own president and the other leaders around the world in Iran. Just because the premier of North Korea is an atheist doesn't mean that he doesn't have a guardian angel.
That's right.
I don't know how much he listens to him, but that's why we'll do the praying, and I think imitating Emperor Karl will be good.
Yeah, to have the angels on your side. I mean, the angels are more powerful than any human being. And so he really utilized all the aspects of our faith that we're given in order to be more successful as a Christian and to spread, to be an example to others. Yeah. He used every means that the church gives us.
This is, especially when you think about the recent horrible attack in Las Vegas, we all need to be praying for the guardian angels of people that would be doing harm on any level. We're going to take a break right now, and we'll come back in a couple of minutes. We want to get some of your questions and your comments, as well as those of our studio audience, so please stay with us. Thank you. We've been talking about Blessed Emperor Karl von Habsburg, who was the last emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we also mentioned the Emperor Karl League of Prayer. If you'd like to find out more about it, you can go online and look up emperorcharles.org, emperorcharles.org, and they'll give you more information about that, okay? Ready for some questions?
Yes.
All right, let's start off with Bill. Bill, where are you calling from?
Sacramento.
Sacramento, California, great. And what is your question?
I was wondering if you could trace a line for us. Hilaire Berlach, in his book, Europe and the Faith, told us that the Junkers, the Prussian ruling class supporting the Kaiser Wilhelm, they were essentially atheistic. And I was wondering if you could trace a line between Bismarck's Kulturkampf and the demonic paganism of Hitler.
Okay, so Yeah, that's a little complicated because there was certainly the Kulturkampf, which means in German the struggle of culture, that was started by the Prime Minister of the Chancellor of Germany, the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck. And he did that against Catholics specifically. And that's why there's so many German Catholics in the United States from that period. Kansas and Cincinnati, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Western Ohio, many Germans moved there. They'd rather stay Catholic than serve Bismarck. But he lost. He had to give up his Kulturkampf. And so there was a strain, especially in northern Germany, in Berlin. That was the least churched area and the most supportive of Hitler. The Catholic areas of Germany were the least supportive of Hitler. He never won any elections in the Catholic areas. But the absence of faith or the anti-faith opened people up to Hitler's pseudo-paganism. It wasn't real paganism, but it was a decoration. He just wanted to control the people, as far as I can see. Do you have any comments about that?
I want just to comment about Wilhelm II. He had contact with my grandfather, and they talked a lot, and I know from what I read and heard that Emperor Karl was always trying to talk to him about making the peace. And exactly like you said, Bismarck was against, and there were lots of generals who were very warmonger, and unluckily Wilhelm II had not the same strength as Emperor Karl, so he gave in. That's the only comment that I want to do about
that he was
Wilhelm
a
II.
weaker man rather than a leader of it. He just couldn't stop his generals, who had a tradition of success. They invaded France in 1870, 40 years before the war. They were very successful very quickly. They overthrew the emperor of Napoleon III. All this was part of it. But, the other countries too were very self-confident.
Yes, absolutely.
The
French people, everybody was happy to go into war. That was the terrible thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
And one of the things too to keep in mind, the press back then also had a very evil influence on it. They would write about the large losses, again, 25 million people. And they would say, well, this is okay because in Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, these are the unfit. That's how they wrote in those days, in the media. And so we don't want stupid ideas to come into attacking human dignity. That's what they did. We have another question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
My name is Luke. I'm from San Diego, California. I currently live in Tyler, Texas. Your Highness, thank you so much for being here and answering our questions. My question is about Blessed Karl as a father and as a leader. As a brand new father myself, I'd love to have some insight about his spiritual life and how he was a leader in his family, in his office, and especially as a father.
How many children do you have?
I just have one, a 10-month-old.
A 10-month-old, congratulations.
Thank you.
How many children did Emperor Karl and Empress Zita have?
They had 8 children.
8 children. And your father was?
And my father was number 6.
Number 6.
The last boy.
Okay. And, so he had a lot more practice than this young man at being a father.
Yes, but he was probably a very affectionate father. I just want to make a parenthesis and saying that I once asked my father, do you remember your father? And he said, Oh, yes, but I was just not even 3 years old when my father died. So, but I still remember this big, strong man who held me very warmly and tightly in his arms. So he must have been a very strong and good father. And it's, of course, very difficult to juggle the position of the responsibility that he had, the work he had, and also the love of his family, because that's what he wanted to do in the first place. And he could juggle it, but it was difficult.
Yeah. But then, you know, after because he was basically deposed as emperor.
Yes.
And then he wanted to accept being king of Hungary,
Yes.
and that also was not allowed.
Unluckily.
And so he ended up going where? Where did he take his family?
Then finally, after the second attempt where he wanted to return to Hungary, they were put into Madeira. Madeira is a little island not far from Portugal. And so...
the famous wine is
yes.
named after it. Yes.
And so he was there, but very poor, because they had not any more money. Everything was taken. There were some jewelries that they had still that belonged to them, but it was stolen. So the life was very hard. And but he was still always there. My grandmother said that he loved to walk around the island with his children, showing the birds and singing. You know, the singing went down to all our generation, because he must have been a good singer, because my fathers and everybody sang, and then also when we are all together, we sing, mostly in church. We love to sing in church.
Yeah.
So he was very close to his family. In Madeira, of course, he had the time to do it.
Yeah, and how old was he when he passed away?
He was only 34. Yeah,
34, so that's a very young father.
Yes, and my grandmother was pregnant from the last child that he never saw. She got the child after his death. What must have been very hard for a mother.
Oh, no doubt. But wasn't also some of the suffering and the poverty was partly what weakened his health, was it not, in Madeira?
Suffering about the...
because they didn't have enough, it was cold, etc.
I think that was not the most problem for Emperor Karl. I think his suffering was that he had an insight that he would die in Madeira. And so his suffering came that first he would never see again his country, and second that he would leave his family alone without guidance, without help. And so that was very anguishing for him. And my grandmother told us about this very hard time that he had to pass.
You make the point, Father Mitch, that they were in complete poverty. And if I can draw a contrast, we just talked about Kaiser Wilhelm II. After the war, he went into exile, he secured a place for himself, and apparently left his people behind. Yes. Karl stayed close. His concern continued to be for his people. He had accepted a sacred responsibility from God for the people of his empire, and he had an insight that now that his civil power had been removed, it was time for prayer and for suffering. His heart was always for his people. And so he had given away everything of his own during the war, and was left really destitute after the war. And so they couldn't afford a hotel, they couldn't afford a place to stay in Madeira. There was one person who left them, allowed them a summer home to live in, which is nice in the summer, but not so nice in the winter. And so the disease which eventually he died from was caused by the high levels of moisture and the cold. And
it can be a very damp cold in the Mediterranean during the winter. You know, very hot and warm in the summer, but you know, I've been in Jerusalem in the winter, and it can be a very damp cold, you know, in the Mediterranean area.
Yeah, going back to Blessed Karl and his family and how he was able, he's a model for all of us in juggling heavy responsibilities at work and very quality family time and relationships in the family, extremely loving. But one thing that should be said is that Empress Zita said later that for him, the family and being with the children was like the Noah's Ark that he could come home to, no matter what terrible stress he was under on an international level or fighting the enemies in his own realm. As soon as he saw one of his children,
that was his refuge.
Yes, it was. That's what she said. It's where he gathered strength to face the burdens of the next day. And you could see that in all the pictures of him holding different children and surrounded by the family. And he loved animals too. There's always a dog in the picture. And it's just so heartwarming to, but I also wanted to say in answer to Lucas that he's a model for leaders everywhere too. But people shouldn't think of that as if you're not the president of the United States or the governor of a state, you don't have to have him as a role model. He's a role model for everybody who must be a leader in their own life, in their own circumstances. That's all parents. They can follow his example of how he inspired people to do the right thing. He's a model for teachers. He's a model for soldiers, for supervisors at work. Anybody in a leadership position can look to his role as putting God first, putting the good of the people under you first, all those virtues.
Let's take another call. We have John on the line. Hello, John.
Hello, Father.
Hi, what's your question tonight?
Countess and guests, welcome to America, and I pray you can help America get the greatness from God, straight from God. Anyway, my question would be, what were the spiritual virtues Blessed Carl had and his wife that we could share with modern-day married European leaders? And thank you very much.
Thank you. So, you know, in terms of the virtues between your grandmother and your grandfather, the kind of, obviously you've spoken much about how much she just loved him and he loved her. You know, it was really mutual. Not always the case in royal families, where marriages were often arranged for political purposes, but they really loved each other and saw goodness in each other. And you said to me, too, how she would speak about how good he was, and he would speak about how good she was. It's typical of saints.
And also they shared a mutual respect, a very big respect that is a little bit lost, and it's difficult to do after a longer time. And also they shared this deep conviction and prayer for God, and that was also a basis in their marriage.
Nice.
And their famous words upon getting married, now we must get each other to heaven.
Yeah.
To help each other.
See, that's the most important virtue, I think, for married people.
Absolutely.
Not, oh, I can fix him.
No.
You're right.
I can fix him. Or, oh, I can get along with her. That's a sort of guys. I can figure out how to get along with her. And women tend to want to say, oh, I can fix him. I can make him a better man, which she probably will do. But how can we get each other to heaven?
Yes.
Is the prior question.
Absolutely.
That's the real question. And they did that for each other.
Okay.
We have another question from our studio audience. Father, where are you from?
I'm from Uganda, Diocese of Masaka.
Wonderful. You win the long distance award tonight.
Actually.
Wonderful to have you. And what is your question?
My question is, I felt something missing in the sharing. This is about how miraculously strong or how favored is now is Blessed Carl before God, so that we can go back and share to the people where we come from that such and such saint is being talked. No, a blessed one, strong, you can invoke, call upon him and he helps you, having taken some examples from what they have narrated. Are there some miracles or some significant signs that he's really enjoying the favors of God now?
Okay, so thank you, Father. This is something where to be blessed, normally, except for martyrs, there needs to be a miracle. So were there any miracles that went on for this beatification?
Yes, Father. Blessed Carl started right away after he died. People in Madeira reported miracles and healing. And by the time of World War II, the League of Prayer had 10,000 reports of healings. I could name a few that he healed. He caused a lady who had no children, and she was already about 40, that really wanted a child. He prayed to him. He caused her to have a child, who later came to his beatification.
Oh, nice.
Yes,
Nice.
and he was particularly favorable to all those who helped him in his days in Madeira. And there was a couple who came over from Austria to help him out. And later on, the man was dying, and his wife was right there. And all of a sudden, the man lying in bed saluted, like in the military. And he explained it by saying, "How beautiful. The emperor is here, and he's helping me."
Yeah.
So we have lots of stories like that in the annals of the church. Now, the church has a very strenuous process for choosing a miracle for beatification and canonization. So for beatification, we have the miracle of the nun down in Brazil who was suffering for years from an affliction. She was bedridden, she was in constant pain, and she resisted praying to Emperor Karl because she just didn't like his family or his politics or something. But she finally, in desperation, said to him in prayer one night, "If I'm still alive tomorrow, I will pray your novena." But the next morning, she woke up and she was completely healed. She was up before all the others in the chapel praying. And she never had a recurrence of any problem.
Great.
So
That'll teach her for not liking the hop sports.
Isn't that the truth? And he's had any number of miracles since that are really, really strong. And the Vatican is examining it now.
Good.
So
That gets to our caller we have. Hello, Christy?
Yes,
Hi, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Boulder, Colorado.
Great. And what's your question?
Well, I'm a huge admirer of Blessed Carl and Zita, and I was wondering where Zita's cause is for beatification.
So how far along is the cause for Empress Zita for beatification?
she needs a miracle.
Okay.
And they're just really beginning, they're still interviewing people.
Okay.
Because one thing that she has God can work with anything. He's going to be able to solve this, I'm sure. But one of the problems is that she outlived everyone that could have otherwise testified. And the people that were her own, I've thought of that many times. I mean, she's at a disadvantage there because the people that lived closely with her were not there any longer. So, but God will find a way, particularly through a miracle, if this is.
I noticed, I mentioned earlier today when we first met, how the Empress Zita died in April of 1989. And I remember it well because just a couple weeks later, my own grandmother, who had been her subject, died the same month. You know, and she was also old. We don't know how old. She never, I don't know if she didn't tell the immigration people the same story twice, or if she just didn't know. We didn't know. But I want to mention again, the Emperor Karl League of Prayer can be contacted online by going to emperorcharles.org, emperorcharles.org. Pray for our political leaders today and for all leadership. I want to thank you all, Your Highness, both Suzanne, Father. And Father, if you would join me in giving a blessing to our audience, may Almighty God bless you and keep you and cause His face to shine upon you and lead you in all of your ways by His peace. I bless you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. And we can have wonderful guests such as these and all the other programs that we do only because the network is brought to you by you. You make it possible with your generosity to us. So, as Mother always said, please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we will be able to pay all of our bills too. God bless you, and thank you.